This portion of the electrical presentation deals with equipment supply and disconnecting means. There's a variety of electrically energized equipment located in schools, and just a few of them are the following. Those that deal with heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and refrigeration. Those that deal with or associated with food preparation, such as burners, ranges, ovens, mixers, fryers, kettles, dishwashers, etc. Those that deal or are associated with technical shops, such as welders or air compressors, etc. Those that are associated with appliances, specifically cord and plug connected appliances, such as electric water coolers, beverage dispensers, refrigerators and freezers, room-style air conditioners, etc. And I think we'll all agree that one of the common features for each of these pieces of electrically energized equipment is that they're motor operated. And the fact that they're motor operated introduces some additional concerns for both safety and operation of the equipment that we're going to discuss in the next few slides. Let's start by talking about some of the safety protocols that need to be increased due to the fact that these pieces of equipment that we're discussing are motor operated. The safe disconnection of the energy source eliminates potential injuries related to electrocution, obviously, but specific to motors and motor controllers, mechanical injuries are also a potential injury due to the fact that with motor operated equipment you've got moving parts, and contact with moving parts is a potential mechanical injury that is unique to motor operated equipment. Obviously, lockout tagout protocols remain certainly important for maintenance and repair personnel and must be employed even during the construction phase when the equipment is energized. An individual disconnecting means is required to be provided for each motor controller and motor, and this is reiterated in Articles 430.102A and B. The disconnect must be located within sight, and as we've discussed before, that's defined as within 50 feet from the motor operated equipment. Now there are exceptions provided to this generalized rule, and we're going to talk about a few of those in the next few slides. Let's start talking about some of the exceptions for motor controller disconnects as identified in Article 430.102A. And the exceptions are the exception to having the motor disconnect or the motor controller disconnect within sight of the motor or the motor controller. The first is for motors that exceed 1000 volts. The disconnect is permitted to be out of sight when the disconnecting means is a branch circuit switch or a circuit breaker capable of being locked in the open position in accordance with Article 110.25. Additionally, a warning label is required on the motor controller identifying the actual location of the disconnecting means. Another situation is a single disconnecting means is permitted to disconnect a group of coordinated controllers serving a single piece of equipment or machine. In this situation, the disconnecting means is required to be within sight from the controllers. The disconnecting means and the controllers are required to be within sight from the equipment or the machine. Continuing with the exceptions for disconnects required to be located within sight from the motor or the motor controller. In situations where you have a valve actuated motor assembly that is containing the controller, the disconnect is permitted in these situations to be out of sight when the disconnecting means is a branch circuit switch or a circuit breaker again, capable of being locked in the open position in accordance with Article 110.25. Additionally, a warning label is required to be mounted on the VAM assembly, identifying the location of the disconnecting means. The two photographs on the right show a visual description of a couple of motor disconnects, lockable type, that we were just discussing. The one on the left is obviously a single pole disconnect switch breaker, and the one on the right is a 3-pole disconnect switch / breaker. And to reiterate what Article 110.25 requires, where a disconnecting means is required to be lockable open, which is what we were just describing is a requirement for the exceptions, it must be capable of being locked in the open position. Additionally, the provisions for locking must remain in place without the lock installed. So the locking provision, the little hasp setup that you see on each of these breakers, has got to be part of the breaker. It can't be a rinky-dink aftermarket weird add-on scabbed-on thing that someone decided was going to be appropriate. That particular hasp lock setup has got to be part of the disconnect itself. Now, when we're talking about just motors, not motor controllers, but motors, the requirement in Article 430.102b clarifies that a disconnecting means must be provided for a motor and located within sight from the motor and driven machinery location. It goes on to say that a controller disconnecting means complying with Article 430.102a is also permitted if it is within sight from the motor and driven machinery location based on Article 430.102b2. So a lot of the exceptions that we just discussed may be applicable to a motor if the controller disconnecting means complies with what we just discussed. Now, there again are exceptions, as is very common in the California Electrical Code. A disconnect is not required when, number one, the location is impractical or increases hazard to personnel or property. And in industrial applications, these require written safety procedures ensuring service by only qualified and trained personnel are provided and available. Some of the duties that a project inspector would apply with respect to verifying motor disconnects are, number one, verify that the disconnects are clearly identified to match the supplied equipment. This requirement comes from Article 110.22a. Also, verify proper voltage and amperage ratings of the disconnect and the equipment. So you want to make sure that the volt and ampere ratings of the disconnect and the equipment match. This is required per Articles 110.4 and 440.12. Additionally, the motor label contains all the required information that you're going to want to review. So when you are reviewing to make sure that the disconnect matches the motor, be sure and take a picture of the motor with all the parameters identified on it and take that down to where the the disconnect is to make sure the parameters match. This is reiterated in Article 430.7. And almost most importantly, verify that the required working clearances are established and maintained for both the motor or the motor controller and the associated panel feeding the motor. And again, this comes from Article 110.26. The picture on the right-hand side of this slide shows a motor and motor controller unit for a roll-up door at a snack bar in a high school. Now, to look at this, you can see that this motor is basically fed, it's hardwired from someplace inside the wall. And it's not apparent that there is a disconnect here. But again, the point is, even though that Article 430, 102A requires a disconnecting means must be within sight from a motor controller. Remember that there may be exceptions that are available that may apply here. So it's important to review the plans for the lockable branch circuit switch or the circuit breaker on this circuit, because that may be identified there. And it's important to inspect per the plans. So the point to take from looking at this slide is don't jump to conclusions ever, understanding that the generalized typical requirement for motor controllers and motors is that the disconnect for those is required to be within sight of the motor or the motor controller. Remember, there are exceptions, and the design team may have taken advantage of the fact that there are exceptions, and they've provided the compliant lockable open circuit breaker in the panel that feeds this motor. So again, inspect per the plans. Now we're going to talk about the disconnecting means associated with appliances. Now for appliances, the branch circuit ratings for the appliances must be per the marked rating, which is verified in Article 422.10. We've got some interesting exceptions allowed or permitted for cord and plug connected appliances, in that an accessible plug and receptacle is permitted to serve as the required disconnecting means. Now this completely makes sense from this perspective. If we understand that the disconnecting means and the purpose for that is for personnel safety when working on energized equipment, then if the maintenance personnel can easily disconnect the power from these pieces of equipment or these appliances by unplugging the cord, then that is certainly sufficient. On the flip side of the coin, permanently connected appliances are discussed in the following slides, so we'll get to that. Overcurrent protection for appliances obviously must not exceed the marked rating of the appliance. This is obvious, it's understood. However, it is important to state because, again, this is going to be reviewed by the project inspector, and you're going to verify that the disconnecting means or the overcurrent protection device for the appliance matches what the plans say, and that will match what the appliance is. Now we'll discuss some of the particular requirements for permanently connected appliances. And there are basically three categories or three situations that we're going to discuss. Number one, when you've got permanently connected appliances that are rated at less than or equal to 300 volt amps or 1/8 horsepower, the branch circuit overcurrent device may serve as the disconnecting means, and the following is an amendment to the 2019 version of the California Electrical Code, and that is where the switch or the circuit breaker is within sight of the appliance, or again is lockable in the open position per Article 110.25. And this information comes from Article 422.31a. The next situation is a permanently connected appliance that's rated over 300 volt amperes. In these situations, the branch circuit switch or the circuit breaker may serve as the disconnecting means where the switch or circuit breaker is located within sight from the appliance or is lockable in the open position per Article 110.25. This comes from Article 422.31b, and as you can see, this is very similar to the newly revised or newly amended requirements for permanently connected appliances that are rated less than or equal to 300 volt amperes or 1/8 horsepower. The third condition relating to appliances that are permanently connected is permanently connected motor-operated appliances rated over 1/8 horsepower. And this verbiage is a new amendment to the 2019 version of the California Electrical Code, and it states that the disconnecting means must be located within sight from the appliance or is lockable in the open position per Article 110.25. This information is found in Article 422.31c. And again, what you can see is the California Electrical Code has basically adopted this same protocol for having a disconnect that is not within sight of the appliance, that is lockable in the open position. Now there is an exception to this, and that exception states if the branch circuit switch or circuit breaker serving as the other disconnecting means is readily accessible, it is permitted to be out of sight from the appliance. So remember, that's readily accessible. As we all know, most circuit breakers that provide overcurrent protection for downstream equipment or components are generally inside of a panel, and the panel has a door on it. So even though those circuit breakers are accessible, they are not considered readily accessible. So that's an important distinction to make here when you've got motor operated appliances that are rated over 1/8 horsepower. The image shown here on the right is a gigantic mixer. You could basically call it an industrial mixer, and it's a motor operated appliance that is greater than 1/8 horsepower. And as we just discussed, the disconnecting means is required within sight of the appliance. But also, as we just discussed, there were several exceptions. And one of the exceptions obviously is where the appliance has a unit switch. The circuit breaker may serve as the disconnecting means when lockable open. Okay? Now, just because you don't see a disconnect in this particular picture does not mean that it doesn't exist. It is certainly possible that the disconnecting means is on the other side of this piece of equipment, and we don't know that. Or it could certainly comply with the exception. So again, the information to take from these exceptions and from the generalized rule of the disconnect required within sight from the appliance or the equipment is that you need to inspect per the plans. The plans are going to give you the information that has been approved by the design team, and you can rest assured that their design and their recommendations for construction comply with the current applicable California Electrical Code. Now we're going to talk specifically about the disconnecting means for HVAC equipment, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning equipment, specifically motor compressors associated with HVAC equipment. Branch circuit selection is required to be in compliance with the nameplate rating, and this is identified in Article 440.4c. The rating or the setting of the motor compressor, branch circuit, short circuit, and ground fault protective device, also abbreviated BCSCGFD, which is a lot of words and a lot of letters in an acronym, must not exceed 175% of the rated load current and the nameplate rating. That's identified in Article 440.22. Now again, there is an exception to this. It may also be permitted to be as high as 225% max of the rated load current of the motor compressor. Now we understand that this is basically a design issue, and that the capacities, the power, and the load of all equipment is going to be reviewed, determined, and identified, verified by the design team. However, even though this is a design issue, it's good to know when you're reviewing the BCSC GFD ratings and settings that it is certainly acceptable if that particular rating is as high as 225% over the max rated load current. We'll talk now briefly about some air conditioning and refrigeration equipment, specifically the disconnecting means required for these pieces of equipment. The disconnecting means must be located within sight and readily accessible from AC, air conditioning, and refrigeration equipment. This is stipulated in Article 440.14. The disconnect is permitted to be installed on or within the air conditioning or refrigeration equipment. However, it is not permitted on access panels, and it is also not permitted to cover the nameplate. Obviously, right? Additionally, it is not required within sight when all of the following instances exist. Number one, there's a lockable circuit breaker provided. Number two, written safety procedures identify and provide for this particular exception. And number three, maintenance and supervision conditions ensure that only qualified personnel will service the AC and refrigeration equipment. So again, it's not as simple as memorizing some simple rules. There are a lot of exceptions to the rules, and it's important to always review the exceptions and the plans before making any determinations for compliance. This picture on the right-hand side of this slide shows an image taken on one of DSA's projects, where you can clearly see the disconnecting means located within sight and readily accessible of the air conditioning units that you can see in the background in this slide. You may also be able to see, I know it's a little bit difficult, but the black labels on the top of each of those disconnects identify, as is required, the actual equipment numbers or the equipment ID that each of those disconnects serve. Now the question is, looking at this slide, can you see any other concerns? And we've basically given the answer just in the second bullet. And the answer is guards are required where mechanical equipment is located within 10 feet of the roof edge. And this requirement exists in the CBC, section 1015.6. And as we've discussed in other presentations, specifically the mechanical code presentations, that this conflicts with the California Mechanical Code. The California Mechanical Code requires that guardrails are installed when equipment is within 6 feet of the edge of the roof. However, the 2019 version of the CBC, section 1015.6, is more restrictive in that it requires guardrails when equipment is installed within 10 feet of the roof edge. So in this particular situation, obviously, these particular pieces of equipment are installed very close to the roof edge, certainly closer than 10 feet, and did require additional guardrails to be installed. So be aware of this conflict between the building code and the mechanical code, and review the plans for compliance. And if you identify that guardrails are not shown on the plans, definitely let the design team know, definitely let the district structural engineer know, and since it is a life safety issue, I would imagine and request that a construction change document is generated. And obviously the DSE is the one that's going to compel the generation of that document. This example shows a picture of an improper working space provided in front of this disconnect attached to this air handling unit. Obviously, this was a poor location for this disconnect. It does not provide the 3-foot minimum depth that is required in front of electrical equipment, and this installation had to be moved. This is a good example of some things that do occur on projects, because there are certainly situations with respect to HVAC where the locations of disconnects are somewhat vague or implied. It has to do with the fact that a lot of electrical, mechanical, and plumbing routing changes at times or is not clearly defined on the plans themselves. Obviously, this particular disconnect required to be moved, and it was moved. But again, the purpose for showing this is that sometimes things happen on projects, and to be ever vigilant and aware of what the code requirements are. This is certainly a situation where if the plans showed this installation, then the plans were a little bit negligent, and you cannot overlook the fact that this is a fire life safety issue. Not necessarily fire, but certainly a life safety issue that requires changing. And again, if it's determined that there's some pushback or some resistance, then a construction change document would certainly be appropriate. And again, the district structural engineer should be notified of this situation, and they are the ones that can compel the design team to issue a CCD for a condition like this. What should you be thinking when looking at an excerpt from a plan view like this? That's right. Read and review every word and every symbol on every plan sheet and specification sheet for every project every time. Now, what we'd like to show is this is a rooftop view showing 3 air handler units. MUA number 1 right here, MUA number 2 right here, and MUA number 3 right here. In addition, it shows 4 exhaust fans. Exhaust fan 10, exhaust fan number 1, exhaust fan number 2, and exhaust fan number 3. Now, as you can see, looking at, let's say, MUA number 1, this little symbol right here with an F in a box, this is the symbol for a fused disconnect. As we've been discussing, this disconnect is required on all air handler units roof mounted, and also generally on all exhaust fans. Now, there's additional information that we should touch on here. If you look at this arrow, this signifies a home run for this particular fused disconnect, which is the disconnect supplying the fan motor inside this air handler unit. This home run is shown going back to panel MDS-KD, circuit number 10. This designation also shows here 3 little hashed lines and 1 curved line. The 3 little hashed lines on this home run designation correspond to 3 ungrounded conductors. This curved line identifies the grounded conductor for this circuit, or also known as the neutral. So again, it's important to understand what each of these symbols and all of these words mean. Similarly, these other air handling units also have fused disconnects. They all go back to the same panel board, but different circuits. You can see this particular one, air handling unit number 1, goes to circuit 10. This particular circuit, air handler unit number 2, goes to circuit 12, and this particular air handler unit, its circuit, derives from circuit number 14. If we look at the exhaust fans, we have a similar situation in that 3 of these exhaust fans 1, 2, and 3, also have fuse disconnects. They also have designations which show home runs going back to panels, the same panel but different circuits. So it's important to understand what these symbols mean and how to read them. An odd thing is here with respect to the exhaust fans is the fact that exhaust fan number 10 does not show a fuse disconnect, which is fine. It's going back to a different panel, which is panel KD1D, circuit number 28. And this note that's designated here in this diamond shape, note number 1, will probably provide additional information relating to that. Another important thing to see and to understand is, since this is rooftop mounted equipment, this equipment's going to require service and repair during some point in their lives, and because of that, an outlet needs to be provided for the service personnel so that they can run their power equipment to use in the repair and servicing that they're going to perform. As you can see here with this note number 2 in a diamond pointing to this receptacle that's identified as GFI, standing for ground fault interrupter, this is the required receptacle that is required on the line side of this particular fuse disconnect. Does that make sense? And this is what's going to allow the service personnel to shut the power off to this particular unit and still have power supplied for them to use at this outlet for performing their service of the equipment.